You probably already heard about it, but there is a story about a soap maker and a rabbi. And once they walked somewhere and saw a homeless person. And the soap maker makes a comment. Look, so many people live religious lives in the world, and yet there are still so many homeless people, so many oppressed people, so many people who suffer. On which the rabbi replied, well, look, there is so much soap in the world, and yet there are still people covered in dirt. The soap maker said, well, it's easy to understand. I can make soap, but I cannot make people use it. Rabbi said, well, is there a difference with religion? There are so many people today who say that religion is in crisis, that there is a decreasing number of people following an organized religion. Yuval Noah Harari, an author of best-selling history books, he argues that religion has a negative impact on our society. It divides people into groups and creates intolerance and tribal hate. Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel, in my view, one of the most influential rabbis in the 20th century, wrote in his book, God in Search of Man, the following. It is customary to blame secular science and anti-religious philosophy for the eclipse of religion in modern society. It would be more honest to blame religion for its own defeats. Religion declines not because it was refuted, but because it became irrelevant, dull, oppressive. When faith is completely replaced by creed, worship by discipline, love by habit, when the crisis of today is ignored because of the splendor of the past, when faith becomes an heirloom rather than a living fountain, when religion speaks only in the name of authority rather than with the voice of compassion, its message becomes meaningless. This question of purpose and failure of religion becomes one of the key themes in Heschel's writings. A good book that summarizes his approach to Judaism and Jewish theology and philosophy in general is written by Shai Held, Rosh Yeshiva and chair in Jewish thought at Machon Hadar. He wrote a book entitled Abraham Joshua Heschel, The Call of Transcendence. In it, Shai Held demonstrates that Heschel had an amazing ability to transcend from the daily routine, from our everyday life, and understand the core of each question and go deep into Jewish theology and philosophy to prove his point. According to Heschel, when we speak about religion and God and try to describe God's attributes, we need to understand one simple thing, that at such moment, when doing so, we speak about ourselves. Questions we ask God, we should direct to ourselves. Critique about God is the critique directed to ourselves. When you speak about God, you inevitably speak about your deepest beliefs and values. Therefore, an indifferent God can only yield an indifferent humanity. If your God does not care about the world, then why should you? In the words of Shai Held describing Heschel theology, the God of Jewish prophets is entirely different. Profoundly affected by the cries of the oppressed, the God of Israel is a God of concern, and to worship this God, really to worship this God, is to have our indifference shattered and our stubborn selfishness torn into shreds. Applying this concept to the Decalogue, which appears in this week's Torah portion, Heschel asks why God begins the Decalogue by reminding us that God took us out from the land of Egypt, the house of bondage, and ends by admonishing us not to covet. Rabbi Heschel suggests that God wants us to learn something critical about freedom. Although God has liberated us from externally imposed slavery, the task of liberating ourselves from internal slavery is giving over to us. Heschel writes, "Nothing is as hard to suppress as the will to be a slave to one's own pettiness. Gallantly, ceaselessly, quietly, person must fight for inner liberty. Inner liberty depends upon being exempt from domination of things as well as domination of people. There are many who have acquired a high degree of political and social liberty, but only very few are not enslaved to things. This is our constant problem, how to live with people and remain free, how to live with things and remain independent. In a moment of eternity, while the taste of redemption was still fresh for the former slaves, the people of Israel were given the Decalogue. Its beginning and end, the Decalogue deals with the concept of liberty. The first saying, I am the Eternal One, your God, who brought us out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of bondage, reminds us that outer liberty was given to us by God. And the 10th saying, the 10th commandment, thou shalt not covet, reminds you that you yourself must achieve inner freedom. Therefore, Judaism is a call to have an internal freedom. But with freedom comes responsibility. This is the first Shabbat where we as a British society and we as a community are given freedom of choice and freedom to decide what we do with it. Over the last year and a half, we lived in the world where our leaders made decisions for us, similar to when Jewish slaves were told to leave Egypt. Today, we are given a chance to be our own masters and accept the responsibility for our lives and the lives of others. We are given a chance to be on a higher level of religious observance, to move from the concept of outer freedom to the concept of inner freedom. This is the move from the letter of the law to the spirit of the law. The move from following instructions exactly as you've been told to the realization that you need to take personal responsibility. This is when religion can help us to navigate in the world of uncertain rules, when faith becomes a heirloom rather than a living fountain, when religion speaks only in the name of authority rather than with the voice of compassion, then its message becomes meaningless. An indifferent God can only yield an indifferent humanity. The God of Israel is a God of concern. And to worship this God, really to worship this God, is to have our indifference shattered and our stubborn selfishness torn to shreds. Ken Yehi Ratzon, may this be God's will, and may this be an understanding of Judaism, our understanding of Judaism, understanding of our society, our community, and humanity.